From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
After 8 years under Peter Kilmartin, Rhode Island will get a new Attorney General come January. Democratic candidate Peter Neronha has essentially gone unchallenged. The former U.S. Attorney is the overwhelming favorite to take over as the state's next top prosecutor. This week, the challenges facing the next Attorney General and the big cases and headaches that person will inherit. Our guest on Newsmakers, Peter Neronha. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on the program, as always, WPRI.com reporter, Eyewitness News reporter Ted Nesi. Peter Neronha, candidate for Attorney General. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So look, your only opponent is Compassion Party candidate Alan Gordon. His campaign doesn't have a lot of money, and in fact, he was even arrested by the state police in a pot sting. He has pleaded not guilty in that. So barring something wild, you will be the Attorney General in January. The other group that is going to be coming in January, of course, is the General Assembly is going to be firing up. What will be your legislative priorities if elected Attorney General?
Well, look, I think we need to do some work in the consumer space. You know, as I've looked at, as I've talked to voters and looked at our consumer protection statutes, I don't think they're as robust as they can be. So we're going to do some work there. We're already starting to put together some ideas about not assuming I'm going to get elected, but I want to be prepared because that comes up so quickly if I am elected. And I am going to ask for grand jury report legislation. I think that's really important.
What's that going to look like?
Well, you know, there are a lot of statutes across the country, different ones, and I'm currently sort of looking at those and trying to pull out the best pieces from them and put together something that I think will have some appeal here. But what it'll look like is it'll be a mechanism where a grand jury can issue a report, even in the absence of indictments, with the court's approval and with a process whereby people who may have come within the purview of the grand jury have an opportunity to object.
Can't the courts already release a grand jury report if they want?
No, they can't on Rhode Island. No, they can't. Rhode Island, under Rule 6 and the court rules, you can't. So absent in the context of an indictment or another civil action, you can. There's a mechanism for doing that. But if there's no pending civil action and there's no pending indictment, there's no way to get whatever the grand jury found out. And I think it's a useful tool, and I think I would use it only in limited circumstances. But in those limited circumstances, it's a way to make recommendations about how we can do things differently that I think can help the public.
And now, some people should understand this would be a seismic shift.
Absolutely.
You know, other states have this.
Yeah, absolutely. Pennsylvania has it. California. There's a federal analog. New York has it. Missouri has one. So yeah, it would be a change in the way we do it. And again, I don't want to create the suggestion that in every case we would be issuing a report. But I think there are cases where it could be helpful. I think there are cases where the grand jury, working with lawyers, can make recommendations about a situation, even in the absence of an indictment, that can change the way we do business. That can be helpful. You know, how much appeal there will be for that mechanism, I don't know, but I really believe we need one, and I'm committed to trying to make it happen.
And I was going to say, we should point out to people, part of why this is such a big conversation right now is that Pennsylvania grand jury report about the Catholic Church sex abuse crisis that came out recently. I asked you a couple months back about would you do one if you were Attorney General, and I actually didn't realize until you said we don't have that statute right now. People's first question are going to be, is that something you'd order if they gave you that authority to do that kind of grand jury report?
Look, I think it's irresponsible to talk about investigations before you're in office, and frankly, to talk about them if you're in office. When I was U.S. Attorney, we didn't talk about investigations except sort of when they were at their end or when there was a specific public need to know in advance in an emergency situation. So let me just say this. I do think that having a grand jury report mechanism in that Pennsylvania case was critical to getting what happened out. There were only 2 indictments in that case, if my memory serves, and over 300 priests who were involved, members of the clergy who were involved in that conduct. So I think it's an important mechanism to have. With respect to clergy abuse, what I suspect will happen if I get elected is that we'll take a look at those allegations. We'll review what's been done to date. I don't know what has been investigated to date and what hasn't been. But like any other allegation of serious criminal misconduct, I'd take a look at it, I'd review what's out there, and then decide how to proceed.
You've got a strong track record of combating public corruption as U.S. Attorney. A lot of those cases find a pipeline through the U.S. Attorney's office, and we've always been told, well, look, that's because the federal statutes are just stronger on that. Does that mean, if elected, Attorney General Peter Neronha is going to defer these cases to the U.S. Attorney's Office?
Oh, I expect not. I don't think we need additional statutes. You know, there's a bribery statute here. There's an extortion statute here. They both can be used. They've been used in the past. When I was on the line in the AG's office, we used it in the case involving the Lincoln Town administrator who was taking bribes. So I don't think we need more tools. I think we just need.
So has the current Attorney General's office been lax in the area of public corruption cases?
You know, the current Attorney General's office partnered with us on a lot of our cases, right? So I wouldn't call them lax. You know, I think they were good partners, is what I would say. I do think that as U.S. Attorney, I took a strong interest in driving the ship, and you know, maybe that was maybe from somebody else's perspective not the greatest partner, but I felt like that if I had control over the case and I was putting it through the grand jury that I controlled, I could make sure that it would go in the way that I wanted it to go. And I don't intend to be shy, if I'm the state attorney general, to do the same thing. If those leads are coming to us, then we ought to direct where it needs to go. I'm a hands-on person. That is my personality. I practiced law for almost 30 years. I love the practice of law. So I don't intend to be a caretaker as Attorney General. I'm going to be involved, and I'm going to push these cases forward if they come to us.
I want to ask you about I'd say the biggest news the AG's office has made in recent months, which is this fight with now former House Minority Leader Patricia Morgan over documents related to the Google settlement money. At a first gloss, look, there's been a lot of controversy around this and how the AG's office has handled it. Do you agree with the approach in general, or would you have handled this situation differently?
Look, I think it's important that the public know how those monies were spent. That case means a lot to me because it was my office that did it. We really changed the way Google did its business in aiding these foreign pharmacies importing opioids into the United States. So that to me was the critical part of this case. The money was secondary, but the money came, and that's a good thing. It's done a lot of good here. And I think, you know, objectively, we know how the money was spent at sort of the 50,000 foot level. It shored up pension programs in East Providence and North Providence with the state police. It's building a new police and fire station in North Providence. That said, you know, the public wants to know how that money is spent. I think the current Attorney General wants that to get out too. He's moving through that process in a way that makes sense to him. I think transparency is important. I think the public ought to know how we're spending those funds. I think if I were the Attorney General, and again, without knowing the particulars, how broad the request was, what some of the specific instances were, as why not to disclose things. Look, I would put out a report that said this is how we spent the money and this is why we did it this way.
What about those fees? So, I mean, would you have waived the fees in the interest of transparency and public interest?
Yeah, look, the issue with the fees is this, right? You're going to spend money. We had this issue when I was U.S. Attorney. In the wake of the Google case, we had a FOIA request from Google shareholders that came to us. It was handled in Washington, but you do spend a tremendous amount of time and money sort of answering these requests. So part of it is to compensate for that. Certainly, in some instances, those fees could and maybe should be waived, but you don't want to be in a situation where you're waiving them every time, because then you've got to take that into account in your budget, both in terms of hours spent and money spent. So maybe we need to think about ways to either capture a public interest exception which is narrow enough that it doesn't, you know, the exception doesn't swallow the rule, or a situation where budgets are enhanced so that there's space in the budget to account for those requests.
How much? So the Google money that came to Rhode Island was, I think, $230 million,
Correct.
Right? Was divided up between the agencies that
Correct.
were involved. How much money of the AG's share of the proceeds, the forfeiture, is left, and how would you spend it?
Yeah, look, I don't know the answer to how much is left, and just to be clear, that money was divided among the investigating agencies. The AG had one investigator on that case, if I recall, part of the FDA task force. They got a percentage of the money. It's kept in Washington, and it's drawn down as it's approved, so it's not in a bank account with the AG. So I don't know how much is left. Look, I think the first thing you've got to make sure is that office, because it's so important to the people of the state of Rhode Island, is running like the best law firm in the state. It's the largest law firm in the state. It's got to have the capacity to do great work. So it's got to have a computer system that works fast. It's got to have the kind of resources to do great work. When I got there, coming from a large Boston law firm, and I asked for a legal pad, I mean, I went to Staples and bought one. I mean, your people have to have the resources to do the work. That said, we should use that money to do as much good as we can. So, for example, the rules are set by the asset forfeiture and money laundering section at DOJ as to how the money can be used, but there is a percentage of money that can be used for a law enforcement purpose that's sort of not in the traditional space, you know. And I think there's a way, if you can bring that into the community and do some good on crime prevention, if there's a way to do that, I'd like to try to do that. But I don't know how much money is left.
We are taping this program on a Tuesday morning, and I mention that because when most people are watching this, we will have aired an investigation into Craig Price. It's coming on Thursday. But again, when most people are watching this, it'll be out. And that's one of the major criminal cases that you're going to be inheriting if you're elected Attorney General. And this is wild to me. You'll be one of 6 attorneys general that have handled the Craig Price case. I look back, it was Jim O'Neill, Jeff Pine, Sheldon Whitehouse, Patrick Lynch, Peter Kilmartin, and potentially Peter Neronha. Veteran prosecutor Patrick Youngs has been sort of the common thread throughout that case. Depending on what happens with a criminal case down in Florida, Craig Price could be released in November of 2019. There are some probation issues potentially up here. Is this case a priority to you, and have you investigated, looked into it as you prepare possibly to take over?
You know, I haven't taken a deep dive into it. Of course, I'm familiar with it, like every Rhode Islander is. How could you not have, spent most of your life here and not be familiar with it? Look, we have to make sure that if Craig Price is released, and that's an if at this point, we don't know how that's going to turn. We've got to make sure that a structure is in place to manage the risk. I mean, obviously there's a risk there. We've got to understand the scope of it, and we've got to make sure we can manage it. And it's not just coming up in the context of Craig Price. We're seeing it elsewhere, right, in the state right now, with the individual who's living in Providence. Is
Richard Gardner.
Yeah, those are complicated issues, right? We've got to understand risk, and we've got to manage it.
How do you do that, though? In both. I mean, I watched the Richard Gardner thing, and you can't help but feel for the people in that their neighborhood, that someone's there who has been convicted of doing what they say he did, and yet if people, these people, they serve their time, they get out, they have to live somewhere.
Right. Yeah, look, it's a complicated situation. And so I was talking to somebody just the other day, and I asked this person the same question, somebody involved in corrections. We've got to analyze the scope of the risk, and then we've got to manage it. And that's got to be managed through probation and parole, right? They're the experts. They're the ones who can size up risk. They know how to manage it. At the same time, and I feel for people living in that neighborhood. I had children. I raised 2 boys, and when they would head out on their bicycles together, having been a prosecutor for 20 years, I wanted to know how long before I could expect to see them at home. You've got to let go, but you worry, right? So it's a complicated situation, and it can't just be, you can't live here, and then so you have to live somewhere else, because otherwise people just keep moving around and it creates more uncertainty. It's a complicated situation. I think all the players involved, prosecutors, probation, parole, to the extent this individual has counsel, need to sit around a table and figure out a way to manage this risk and keep people safe, particularly children.
All right, we're going to take a break here on Newsmakers. Our guest is candidate for Attorney General Peter Neronha. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my left, Eyewitness News reporter Ted Nesi. Our guest this week is candidate for Attorney General Peter Neronha. Peter, if elected, I want to talk to you about how you might structure the office. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but some important questions here about how you staff it. The Attorney General gets most of the attention, but there are people that veteran staffers that have been working behind the scenes for a long time with institutional knowledge. You think of names like Deputy Attorney General Jerry Coyne, Chief of the Criminal Division Stacey Baroni, Deputy Chief of Criminal Patrick Youngs. I brought that up in the first half under Craig Price. Do you feel like you need to surround yourself with your crew to shake things up and make some changes in those positions, or are they an important backbone to the agency?
I think frankly it's too soon to really comment on that. I will say this: I think it's important that every Attorney General, I think, comes to the office with a certain vision, and I have mine, and it's informed by my experience, both as U.S. Attorney and before that, and it's frankly been informed by the things I've learned while running for office. And your team around you has to reflect that vision, and so until you sit with them and really talk to them, it's hard to say. But I do think that when you've been elected to that position, as I hope to be, and you look at the world a certain way, it's really important that your team also reflect that.
One of the biggest challenges you're going to face when it comes to staffing and structuring your office, and I think you know this, is retention. Talk to anyone over there and they'll tell you that pension reform and longevity has been made it difficult to retain relatively, in the legal community, relatively low-paid prosecutors over there. You've got the top staffers, and then you have the new people that come in. To me, it looks like that middle class of the Attorney General's office is sort of eroding. How do you recruit, train, and then, more importantly, retain them?
Look, I think you do everything you can to explain to young lawyers, because it's really where you're going to be recruiting from, how great the work is. I mean, I've done it for 20 years. I've loved it. I've loved it. I was in private practice at a big law firm in Boston, 800 lawyers today. It had 300 when I was there. I got paid a lot of money, but I love nothing more than the work I've been doing for the last 20 years. And I think for some people, they'll stay for that reason. It's why I stayed. So look, you go out and you recruit, and the other thing is, and this is why I think vision is so important, right? I like to think of myself as an activist U.S. attorney. If I saw something that I thought was wrong, then we were looking for a hook to try to fix it. And I think if you bring that vision and that view and that approach to an office, that your people get energized.
But that'll last only 8 years at best, right? Because you're term limited if you get elected this time, and if you're reelected, that's 8 years, and then those people will, will be left. How about, would you be open to approaching, there's been talk at this, the General Assembly, to change the classification of employees at the Attorney General's office, so they would fall under different protections?
I think that's something we're talking about, but I spent 6 or 7 years there, I didn't spend a decade there or 2
You
decades.
left. You get my point, right?
I did, but I left to do sort of the same thing somewhere else, right? And there are people who will tell you, look, I interviewed people from the AG's office when I was U.S. attorney, and they wouldn't come. Right? They wouldn't come, they're still there. There's lots of good people in that office, and there are other good people too who will come there, and they may give you 6 or 7 years, and they'll give you great 6 or 7 years, and they'll move on, but you'll get great 6 or 7 years out of them, and other people will stay. So look, do I think those attorneys are, in a sense, undervalued? The answer is yes. I think they're, by and large, as a group, it's a top place. But that said, you have to expect turnover, you have to recruit good people, and you have to energize the people who are there.
Do you think the cost of law school is affecting that ability to recruit people? I have friends who went to law school, they take on a lot of debt, and then to go into a public service job, it can look like you need to go into some white shoe law firm or something to pay off your bills.
Well, that's why I did it. I had a lot of student debt when I graduated from law school. That's why I went there, in the first instance. I learned a lot there too, so I had a great experience there, but that was a big reason I went. I think there are some student loan forgiveness programs today that didn't exist when I was graduating from law school. Maybe that helps, but sure. I have 2 sons, they're both in college, and if I were to counsel them about what to do after college, one of the issues with law school is what's the job market look like when you get out and how much debt do you have? So I think that's got to be an issue too. But again, I come back to, when I was U.S. attorney, we didn't have a hard time, writ large, recruiting people. I think that there will be people who will want to do that work because the work is something that gets into you. And when you come home at night and you're working for the people of the state, it may sound trite, but it means something. And I don't think it'll be a problem to get good people and keep them. I don't.
All right, I want to turn to an issue coming up a lot in the governor's race, which is immigration. The candidates for governor, they're arguing right now over whether the state should change its policy so the state police would proactively notify ICE if an inmate ICE wants to deport is about to be let out of prison. You were asked to become the state's top prosecutor. What do you think? Should the state proactively notify ICE?
Yeah, look, I think that is one place where, generally speaking, I think that local and state law enforcement need to be focused on violent crime, regardless of who's committing it. Undocumented, green card holders, citizens. It doesn't matter to me. And I don't think that law enforcement, local and state law enforcement, should go out and do immigration work and be immigration officers. I do think, though, that when a violent criminal is being released from the ACI, that's why they're there in the first place, presumably, that there ought to be a strong line of communication between the ACI and ICE. I mean, I think, frankly, I think that's probably how it works in real life. When I talk to local law enforcement, state law enforcement, they distinguish, as we should, between people who drive violent crime and people who don't, right? And that's where our focus should be. But to use immigration as a political point, I think is unfair to people who are in the country that are undocumented and not committing any crimes at all, which is the vast majority of them. I think we have to have a rational immigration policy. Certainly, we have to secure our borders. But the reality is, we have 8 million people here who are undocumented, round numbers. They're raising children. They're married to citizens. They're working hard. They have children who are citizens. So we have to think about this in a thoughtful and holistic way, rather than making it a sort of a political ball that we bounce up in the air all the time.
Do you think, on a separate related question that's coming up, is whether law enforcement should hold prisoners for ICE even in the absence of a court warrant? It sounds like that might be a bridge too far for you.
Yeah, it is, because the problem is, if you do that and ICE never shows up, then you're facing a lawsuit that's happened both here and in Massachusetts. In fact, the law in Massachusetts is the Supreme Judicial Court of there has ruled that the state and local folks can't do that. So here's what happens, right? Let's just be clear about what happens. When you get arrested and you're printed, your fingerprints go electronically to ICE in real time. They have them instantly. ICE knows who is in the custody of the Providence Police Department. Say, if ICE wants to go down and pick that person up when they're discharged on bail, whether that be in court or at the police station, they can do that. I don't think that state and local law enforcement, with all that they have to do, should be doing ICE's work for them. If the president is true to his word that this is a priority for him and he wants to hire 10,000 new immigration agents, then by God, go do it. But don't expect state and local law enforcement to do it when we've got violent crime issues right here in our state.
You know how that drives some people bananas, though, right? Sure. I mean, here's somebody, that is presumably breaking a law, be it a federal or state law. They're breaking a law that they're in the country illegally, and you're saying law enforcement shouldn't hold them.
Well, if federal law enforcement wants to make that a priority and the American people think that's a priority, that's great. But here's the deal, right? Here's the deal. If you've got somebody who is in South Bend, Indiana, a real case, who's been here for 20 years, has checked in with ICE, okay, never committed a crime, never gotten a traffic ticket, running a business, married to a U.S. citizen, 2 children who are U.S. citizens, and that person's deported as what happened. What happens to that business? What happens to those kids? We've got to think about this in a practical way. And my point is...
But that person you just said didn't commit a crime. I think, aren't you talking about people who commit a violent crime?
Well, no, but Tim's crime is somebody coming into the country unlawfully. This person did exactly that, okay? But I don't view that as a kind of violent crime that we need to be focused on in state and local law enforcement. Providence Police is down 100 officers. Should they be out rounding up people who have committed no crime other than being in the country?
And I don't want to spend too much time on it, but that isn't the question we're saying here. We're not saying should Providence Police be rounding them up, because this is a big debate locally and nationally. Sure. But why don't we move on, because we have only a few minutes left. A disclosure before my next question. I'm a board member of the New England First Amendment Coalition. I always ask you about public records and transparency. Last time you were on the show, I'd asked if you were open to shifting any of the APRA complaints to the Secretary of State's office. So I'm going to ask you a broader question. Legislation to improve our public records laws. When I ask you about your legislative priorities, that wasn't one of them, and I acknowledge it's not a sexy topic. I think candidates don't always feel like it's something that gets them elected or reelected, but I've made the argument in a state that has a history of corruption, straightening out our public records laws might help there. Sunlight is important. Are you comfortable with the APRA law right now, or should there be changes?
I haven't thought that through in any depth, really, Tim. I think, look, if there's an issue with how we're handling public record requests, we ought to sit around the table with the stakeholders and try to figure that out, as I did recently when I met with some of those stakeholders. Look, I think the issue is this, right? The statute exists. There are always going to be things that are pretty clearly not disclosable and things that are pretty clearly should be disclosed. And there's that big gray area in the middle. My view, to the extent that I am dealing with those in terms of the agency that I were to lead, if I do become Attorney General, would be when in doubt, turn it over. And that would be the approach I would bring to sort of educating others about doing it. I think we're better off when we're not hiding the ball, particularly, sometimes we create our own issues by just not being really smart about how we think about them. And, I think when in doubt, we should turn it over, be as transparent as you can.
And real quick, somewhat related, body cameras and police officers, right now it's sort of a town by town. Yeah. Do you think there should be a uniform statewide policy?
I do, and I'm in favor of body cameras.
Would you spearhead that effort as Attorney General if elected?
I would certainly advocate for it. We ought to know what happens, right? As a prosecutor, I always wanted to know exactly what happened, right? I didn't want to, the more I knew about what happened, it could be a taped statement by a defendant or it could be something on a body cam. Let's know what happened and then we'll sort out how we deal with it.
One of the biggest things that will fall in your lap if you're elected is the proposed Partners Care New England merger, which the AG's office will have to clear. If we look back to the last big one that went through, which was the Charter Care takeover, Fatima Hospital's pension was left in a horrible mess because the AG's, in part, because the AG's office greenlighted a deal that left it with no source of funding. Right. What did you learn from that? And do you think the AG's office needs to take a different approach when they vet these deals, now that you've an even bigger one coming across the desk?
Well, look, that's a critical area, right? We don't have a healthcare strategy in the state. There hasn't been a written healthcare strategy for Rhode Island since the late 80s, early 90s. So, let's back up and talk about that for a minute. We've got to have a strategy in place to understand how these proposed mergers fit within that strategy. Pretty hard to analyze an individual transaction without knowing where it fits from a larger perspective. In terms of the St. Joe's issue, here's the problem with the current statute as I see it from the Attorney General's perspective. The word pension is in that statute only once, and it's not a criteria whether to say thumbs up or thumbs down on one of those mergers. It should be in there. If that's a criteria, and it should be, then it should be in the statute. And again, I think we just have to be, we have to understand how these individual transactions fit into the greater whole. If you go around and think about why hospitals are where they are, it's not a strategic purpose to them. It's a accident almost of history. So I think we've got to be more strategic in terms of our healthcare planning and our energy. It's another one that comes to mind.
As Ted brought up, Partners is going to be a big case that the next Attorney General inherits. Have you talked to anybody that's involved in that, or have you started to do your homework on the Partners? I mean, criminal gets a lot of the focus, but this is on the civil side, sure, and it's going to draw a lot of resources.
Sure,
we have less than a minute left.
Yeah, look, I agree. Civil is important. Yeah, I have, but I haven't done it in the context of a particular transaction. You know, I'm married to a primary care doctor. I always start at home when I'm trying to learn about healthcare. But I've gone around and talked to stakeholders. Talked to Brown, some of the other healthcare institutions, Coastal, where my wife's a partner in the interest of full disclosure. I think it's important to understand these issues before I get elected. If I do get elected, I'll be ready to handle them.
All right, candidate for Attorney General Peter Neronha, thank you very much for joining us on the program. If you missed any of it, it is online, WPRI.com. For Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.